Let's read Romans 8, the familiar words that we'll be looking at in more detail this afternoon. Romans 8, 28 and 29. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. In this sermon, we're going to go through two parts. The first part, the question is God working all things for good? And we'll look at Psalm 44, and then we'll sing Psalm 44. And then I'll preach the second half of the sermon, where we see God is working all things for good, and then we'll sing the words of Romans 8 with hymn 35. Dear brothers and sisters, I'm sure you've heard these words a lot. Maybe one of those well-known passages. God works together all things for good. God works all things together for good. And this is another passage, once again, if we take out of context, and if we just kind of grab it and apply it very quickly into our lives, we can do more damage than good. Some can take this out of context by taking the word good and defining good by how we see good. So God is going to work for my good. He's going to give me the good life. He's going to give me a life that's comfortable and predictable. And now many of us here, we hear that. We know that that's not what is promised for those who love God. We know that a life of being a Christian often involves suffering. And yet we can still apply this passage in a way that hurts. And I know I've been guilty of this in the past too, and perhaps you have. When someone's going through a really rough time, when someone's going through disappointment, tragedy, chronic illness, whatever it is where they're at a low, at times we can come alongside them and we intend the best, but we grab this passage and we say, well, God, he works all things for good. And although that's true, it can become a meaningless platitude, something we quickly grab to apply to very deep wounds of suffering saints. God works all things together for good. Has that become, in our day and age, simply a platitude? Well, if you look at the context, you see that the answer is resounding no. You see in the context of Romans, of the author of this, Paul, and you see in his life that he was someone who was well acquainted with suffering. When Paul was, as he describes in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, when he was adrift on the open sea for a day and a night, was he thinking all things work together for good? When Paul was being stoned, or when he was being lashed 5 different times in his life by those he's trying to help, was he thinking, God works all things for good? When a congregation he dearly loved, like the Corinthian church, was at times falling apart and breaking into different factions and even doubting Paul's good intentions towards them, was Paul thinking all things work together for good? Paul didn't always feel this way. And you see the whole context of Romans 8 it's immersed in suffering. If you look at verse 22 and 23, we read about creation groaning. We read about us groaning as we wait for the redemption of our bodies. Groaning is the life of a Christian. And Paul in verse 35, he talks about tribulation and distress and persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, or sword. And then he quotes from Psalm 44. He quotes from Psalm 44 to show that suffering is something that is to be expected for a Christian. He quotes those words, verse 36 of Psalm 44, "For your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered." Paul knew that it didn't always feel like God is working all things together for good. Paul had Psalm 44 on his mind as he wrote Romans 8. And if you go back to Psalm 44, I invite you to turn in your Bibles to Psalm 44. We read that, but you see it's a very unique psalm. It's a psalm that starts off on such a high note. In verses 1 through 8, the psalmist describes what God has done in the past. He says, we've heard what you've done, God. We've heard what you've done for our fathers when you brought them into this land. We heard about how you planted them in this land and that you were their God. And in verses 4 to 8, the psalmist says that this God of our fathers is also our God. It's a God that we trust in, and we have seen your power. We have seen your presence. We have seen you saving us from our foes. But then you get to verse 9. But you have rejected us. You have disgraced us. You have not gone out with our armies. You have made us sheep for slaughter. You sold your people for a trifle. You demanded no high price for them. The psalmist is saying, God, it feels like we're worthless to you. You say you are with us, but it's like we mean nothing to you. And he goes on, he says, you've made us the taunt of our neighbors. We're a laughing stock. Shame is covering us. And then in verses 17 and following, you get something that, as far as I know, looking at all the other psalms, something that's unique to this psalm alone. Because the psalmist says, all this suffering isn't because of us. It's not because we have been false to your covenant. It's not because our heart has turned back. It's not because our steps have departed. But it's you who are forgetting us, God. Verse 22, we are not forgetting your covenant, yet for your sake, the words that Paul quotes, for your sake we're killed all the day long. We're regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. And then you get this powerful finale in 23 to 26. Awake, why are you sleeping, Lord? Why are you hiding your face? Why are you forgetting our oppression and our affliction? Wake up, God. Help us and redeem us and save us. And then the psalm ends. Psalm 44. Imagine asking the psalmist or telling him, well, all things work together for good. This psalm is the cry of a believer who has known God's presence in the past, but who now knows God in his absence. And yet he has no one to turn to but God. He turns to God with this lament. And for us, this psalm, maybe there's been a season in your life that this psalm seems to be the perfect script for your suffering. Suffering at times that felt pointless, unexpected, and long-lasting. As we walk in faith, there are times when God feels so close, so present, that we can belt out the words of Psalm 121. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. My help comes from the one who never sleeps and never slumbers. But then there's other times in the walk of a Christian that we cry out in the words of Psalm 44, awake, O Lord, why are you sleeping? Why are you hiding your face from me? Why does it feel like you're not here with me in what I'm going through? And it can add to our shame and our guilt when we are low and suffering mightily, and yet we're expected to be close to the Lord in those times. When someone comes and says, it's all going to work out for good. Come on, just where's your faith? Because the hard truth that this psalm brings up is not that God can't help us. The psalmist makes it very clear. He says, we've heard what you've done in the past, and we've experienced that. We've known you going out with our armies and helping us. But what hurts so much is knowing you can help us, knowing you can be present, and yet feeling like you're hiding your face. Why for us as a Christian does God at times feel so present and at other times feel so distant? Well, I can't give you the answer to that. But one thing I can tell you is that God wanted this psalm in the Bible. He wanted this psalm as a script for the sufferer, feeling like God is not working together all things for God, feeling that God is not present, that he has forgotten them in their oppression and their affliction. It's a psalm, a script for the sufferer. And so let's sing the end of part 1 here, Psalm 44, a few of the verses. We see God in his sovereignty. He wanted this psalm in the Psalter. He wanted us to be singing this. And yet the questions at the end, God will not leave hanging there. Why are you sleeping, O Lord? Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction? We see that God will not leave those questions hanging there. And we see already in the shadows that the answer is coming. Psalm 45 is beautiful because Psalm 45 is a psalm about a king that's coming. It's about a king who's God's answers to these questions. A king, verse 5, who comes to ride out against our enemies. Because we see Even though in the history, like God was hiding his face, that he had forgotten them, that he was asleep, we see that behind the scenes, God is working all things for good. We see that God is not asleep, but he is working out everything perfectly so that a king will come from the line of Judah. We see that he has not forgotten his people, but that he is bringing it so that a king will come, a king who is the Son of God, God of very God. God himself would come down, become one of us, and experience this psalm. We read about a king who comes, and in his life, there are times where he feels so close to God that he even hears the voice of his Father from heaven. And at other times, as he's on the cross, he cries out, "Why have you forsaken me? Why are you hiding your face? Why have you forgotten me?" And we know exactly why he called that out. We don't know in our own lives why God sometimes feels distant, but we know why Jesus experienced that on the cross. Why have you forsaken me? Because he was the sin bearer, because in him God was reconciling you back to himself. And because of him, Paul can pick up this psalm positively. Because the beautiful thing, as you read in Romans 8, Paul could not leave Psalm 44 hanging there. He could not leave Psalm 44 with those questions hanging there. So he quotes near the end of the psalm to show how suffering is to be expected for a Christian. He says, "Yet for your sake we're killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered." He's saying, we suffer, and we suffer hard, and at times we feel like God is hiding his face. But the question is, shall these things separate us from the love of God? Shall tribulation, shall distress, shall persecution and the sword, shall times where we feel like God is hiding his face and he's far away from that, will those times separate us from the love of God? And what's his answer in verse 37? You can look in your Bibles. No. No. It's the strongest adversative in the Greek. No, not at all. In fact, in all these things, says Paul, we're more than conquerors through him who loved us. Because of Jesus, we can know that even at times where we feel the depths of Psalm 44 being hidden from God's presence, we can know that those times cannot possibly separate us from the love of Jesus. And in him, we're more than conquerors. And that's why, to back up to our text, Romans 8, verse 28 and 29, that's why Paul can start with those words. And it's very important we understand that he says, we know. Because of Jesus, we know that all things work together for good. Notice Paul doesn't say, and we feel like God works all things together for good. We often don't feel like that. And that's why we say we know that God works all things together for good. But if you look at your Bibles, look with me, Romans 8, verse 28 and 29, because we have to see here that God's definition of working everything to the goal of our good is very different than what our definition is. We often think that God working together for our good means that we'll be happy and healthy, comfortable and predictable lives. But look at God's definition of what it means to work together all things for our good. If you keep reading, so we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose, or according to his plan. And then verse 29, you read, what is his plan? Well, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Listen carefully. What is God's definition of good for your life? It's to conform you to Jesus. God's definition of what is best for you and what is good for you is to mold you into Jesus, into both his sufferings and his glory. Let me ask you a question. Are you able to accept God's definition of what's ultimately good for you? God says through this passage that the best thing for you is to be conformed into the image of Jesus Christ. And if you know Jesus and if you look at his life, you see that the way up was down, that the way to the crown was through the cross, that there was suffering before glory, and that's the pattern of Jesus' life, and that means that's the pattern of our lives. But I challenge you to think about this. What could be better for you than being conformed to Jesus? What could possibly be better for you than being conformed to Jesus until that day where we perfectly think like him, act like him, talk like him? God is working all things together for good. That means conforming you to Jesus. And before close, there's a few more points I want to share with you from this passage, Romans 8. The first thing is that God is harnessing his full power as God to work together all things to that end. So it's a detail we can miss, but it's beautiful. It says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. Not just most things, but every single thing in your life, God is working together for good. And there's an analogy I heard this week that helped me, and hopefully it helps you as well. How many of you here like baking? No one likes baking. One person. Anyway, I don't know if you've ever baked and you think about the individual ingredients that are going into your baking. I was thinking about this last night. I made pancakes for our family, and they were pretty good. Anyway, and I was thinking about each individual ingredient. So 4 raw eggs. If you take them on their own and try to eat them, it's pretty gross. 2 cups of flour. I doubt anyone here has ever tried to eat a cup of flour. Some olive oil, some salt, and then the only ingredient that's perhaps good on its own is milk. But every single one of those ingredients was necessary, and when you put them together, you get delicious pancakes. And thinking about this, in our lives, there's individual things that might not be good on their own. Death is not good. Illness is not good. Relationship breakdown is not good. Chronic illnesses are not good. But God is weaving all those things together, grinding them all together to make something perfect and beautiful and to conform you to Jesus. And every ingredient is necessary to make those pancakes, and so is every single thing that comes your way necessary to come together to that full picture so that you look like Jesus. God never wastes anything. Every second in your life where you felt far off from God, every moment you wanted to cry out, how long? Every second that you spent in a dark pit wondering where God was not wasted. Every tear that has ever fallen from your eye has a purpose. Because as Paul says elsewhere, 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17, our afflictions are a preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. God isn't wasting one little thing in your life. And the last detail before we conclude, because we see the ultimate goal of why God is doing all this, is actually not about us. And that is freeing. Look at Romans 8, verse 29, the second part of the verse, the very end. So God says he's working all things together for good, who have been called according to his purpose, and then he describes what that purpose is, that he's conforming us to the image of his Son. But now we get the ultimate purpose, in order that he, the Son, might be the firstborn among many brothers. Why is God working together every detail in your life for good? It's so that Jesus might have a family that looks like him. That's the point of it all. That's the goal of it all. That's the end of it all. It's about Jesus receiving a family through suffering who's being conformed to look like Jesus. It's about him. Jesus receiving a family who closely resembles him, a family, brothers and sisters, that he loves so much that he was willing to go through Psalm 44 agonies for, a family of brothers worth so much to him that he died for them. A family of brothers and sisters he is holding on to, bringing them to himself. He's bringing us all to a day that we will say, maybe what we don't always feel fully today, but what we will say fully with full knowledge and conviction when he comes back. We'll say, shall my suffering or distress or persecution or tribulation separate me from the love of Christ? Shall those times of God feeling like he's hiding his face and forgetting about me and that he's asleep in my life, shall those times separate me from the love of God? And we will answer with full conviction, no. No, in all those things, we were more than conquerors through him who loved us, because he was working together everything, every single thing for our good.